Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company, and I'm delighted today to welcome a colleague from Action Sustainability, Charles Naud. Hi Charles, how are you doing?
Hi, Sean. I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. So Charles, we usually try to kick off these sessions by understanding a little bit more about the interviewee, as it were. So would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to be where you are in your career so far?
Sure, absolutely. It started at university, I guess. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with myself, and I did an undergraduate in finance and economics, and aspects of it were interesting, and aspects of it I thought, this isn't the world that I want to be in, professionally speaking. And I started becoming quite interested at the time in environmental sustainability. As part of my studies, I spent some time in Chile and a lot of time in nature, and it just got me thinking about the world and our planet and the health of it. And so that sort of got me decided on, first of all, doing my undergraduate thesis on forestry management in Peru. And then afterwards, I got really interested in that and decided to build myself up to a master's in sustainability, which I started about sort of 15 months later. I mean, I didn't really look back after that master's as to where I would work in, what field. It was always about sustainability. I happened to, but by accident, like many of these things, got a job in a small startup that was mixing technology, software technology, and sustainability, and trying to bring solutions to large corporates around sustainability and how to find sustainable innovations, tech innovations. So a software that was helping that. And through that, just started learning more about the space, about procurement, about different types of technology, energy efficiency technology, and so on and so forth. But really, the core of what I was developing as my own skill set was understanding how software fits into that and helps processes and streamline processes for businesses. So fast forward, a couple of more startups later, and then I find myself at Action Sustainability. And my background is I joined the business in 2018, and I've been heading up our reporting solutions that we have at the business pretty much since day one, which is helping, it's very much follows the career progression from that perspective. It's very much about trying to find smart, pragmatic solutions that streamline the data collection and reporting processes for large corporates when they're looking at their supply chains, and trying to use that to generate further discussions and an impact, and organizations to take action on that data. So I've been doing that for the last 8 years, and that's my journey so far.
And I hate to bring rugby into this conversation because our listeners, I guess, will be surprised to learn that you're actually French, even though you don't sound like a Frenchman. But you actually joined Action Sustainability through rugby.
Yes, I did. I met Ian at Old Street Rugby Club, and he has been the chairman there for quite a few years, and I was playing rugby there at the time. And so that's how I got to know about Action Sustainability. And my first interaction with Action Sustainability was wearing our rugby shirt, which had the sponsor of Action Sustainability on it. So before I knew anything about this, I knew the name of Action Sustainability. It made for a very easy interview and selection process, I must say.
Yeah, quite an unconventional recruitment process, but
Yeah,
it worked for all of us. So, Charles, as you say, yes, what you're about software and solutions for sustainability reporting, performance management, but I guess what we've learned and you've learned over the years is it's not just about software. Software kind of seems to be the almost, I hate to say it, the easy bit. Can you talk to us about your experiences and some of the challenges that you've had around performance management?
You're correct. I would say that software is not the easy bit. However, I don't think any of it is easy, but it's the easiest bit, and it certainly should be. But you're absolutely correct. Software is just, it's a tool, right? It's not an objective in itself. It doesn't provide the end outcome that we need, and it's software typically is a tool that helps to make a process better and more efficient, to organize it. But really, when it comes to sustainability reporting, and it depends what we mean by reporting, but very often there's data collection process that's involved, and that's the hard work. And it's really hard for many things, but often it involves data collection, involves multiple stakeholders all trying to understand the same thing, providing data in a consistent fashion, understanding why they need to do it, so making sure that they actually do it and comply with your requirements, understanding how they can spot errors, understanding what the data means, etc. And therefore, you need a bunch of people educated and a bunch of people convinced. And the software is sort of the second part. Once they're convinced, once they understand everything, once they comprehend the requirements, then that's when you move into the software bit, which is basically a process, right? We don't really need the software itself. What we need is the process and the standardization. That's what in reporting typically a software brings. Of course, you might say, well, it also brings visualization and dashboards, etc. But all of that is just speeding up and automating processes that you could do elsewhere.
So when you talk about multiple stakeholders, obviously this is all about the supply chain, isn't it? And the various tiers of the supply chain reporting. What does success look like? Do you have it? Because as you say, that there are all these challenges, hundreds, sometimes thousands of suppliers, all required to report in the same way and all need to understand it. Where have you seen clients doing this well, and what's their secret? And conversely, what does bad look like as well?
So we're focusing here on the supply chain. However, this also applies when organizations need to report internally and need different stakeholders involved. So I think that, we just got to be aware that doesn't reduce itself only to procurement professionals from that perspective. Now, yes, it can involve hundreds or thousands of suppliers. So there is, we apply a methodology with our clients where we go step by step. I'm going to try and not to forget some of the key details of it, but I'll to respond to your question on I'll talk through the methodology, because if you follow that methodology, well, you're on the way to doing something that's quite robust and best practice. So first of all, it's got to start with, of course, why are you doing this, right? So let's take an example of a large, let's say, infrastructure program in the UK. I'm familiar with that space, so I'll take that as an example. Large infrastructure program in the UK. Why would they be interested in sustainability reporting? Why, and more specifically, why would they be interested in sustainability reporting in the supply chain? So first of all, you want to understand that, because that's going to be a founding pillar to understanding, how you go about the process, and it's going to help you make some key decisions. It's going to help you make those if you understand that foundation. So I might take an example whereby they need to, this large infrastructure program need to report data. They're mandated by the government, right, to report data. It's part of the funding of the projects and the conditions of the license of a project and so on and so forth. So first of all, we understand why they're doing it, what's driving them. Then comes the what. So the what will be a bunch of, typically speaking, sustainability performance indicators that need to be reported back. And to be able to calculate those performance indicators, you need supply chain data. I might add that in this example, I'm purely focusing on, let's report some data back to a government agency. You can see here that we're talking about performance indicators and we're talking about the supply chain. So if I'm collecting data from my supply chain that's going to enable me to measure performance indicators, I'm also in the reign of being able to performance manage, right? And understand how well suppliers are doing on sustainability. That could also be a secondary or a primary driver. So if I just come back to the thought process, it's what do I need to collect? typically speaking, I need to collect some data that will help me measure performance indicators. So that strictly defines what the data I should be collecting and focusing on. Just examples of at that level, how organizations do it well. In a real world scenario, you often don't just have one stakeholder you need to report data to. You have multiple things that come into play. Particularly if you're a business, you will have maybe some what we call ESG reporting requirement. You might have some investors who require some data from you. You might have your own sustainability strategy as well. And that doesn't 100% align with what your investors are asking you or what the UK government is asking you, right? So that will come into play as well. So what you do is you start creating a map of what do I need to measure, right? And why? So some of it is for the UK government, some of it's for my investors, some of it is for supply chain performance management, some of it is to measure my, help track our strategy. Those who do it well are able to sort of combine all of that into something that's comprehensive and that is not overly burdensome or too long. Ideally, your strategy is aligned to that of your clients and to your investors and and your procurement strategy is as well. So ideally, actually, you're all asking for pretty much the same information, right? And so you're able to come to something that's, to a list of let's say, I mean, it depends on the size of your organization, but we typically focus on key performance indicators. The crucial word there being key. So they're key. You don't have 500 of them. So you have a set of performance indicators, and that helps you define the what. So examples of those might be carbon emissions by £1 million of turnover. There might be percentage of waste that's not gone to landfill. It might be ratio of full-time employees that are apprentices or in some other sort of education program, and so on, really across environmental, social, financial, sustainability, however you define it. So those are examples of those, right? So I'll just recap. You understand your drivers, you understand all the KPIs you want to measure, you've actually prioritized them, so you know the really important ones and you focus on those. And those are defined, potentially categorized. Then that gets you to a point where you can start saying, right, these are the data points I need to collect. And there you specify them. You really sit down with your stakeholders and you write them in really simple, plain English of going, these are all the data points I need to measure these key performance indicators. And you map that against now who needs to report that data. And that's where, when we think about the supply chain, a lot of these things, you'll start saying, well, I need all my suppliers, or I need some suppliers to report this data. And you start mapping that. And so that almost helps you to create a data sheet for your supply chain. Those that do it well take a smart approach to this, in the sense that when you're looking at your supply chain and you're asking them for data, you don't necessarily ask everyone for everything. You prioritize and you categorize your suppliers and you go, right, well, these are the big hitters for carbon, so I'm going to ask them for carbon. These are the big hitters for waste, so I'm going to ask them for this data. This is a really small spend supplier it's a one-person company. I'm just not going to ask them for anything because it doesn't impact that much. It's not going to make a difference to my numbers. All of this depends on the size of your spend, the size of your supply chain, and so on, and the different priority topics. But you go through that process as well, and organizations that do it well do it that way. So hopefully I've taken you through, for the time being, where are we in the journey? We've understood why. We've developed a reporting framework, as we might call it, right? The KPIs and what data we need to collect. We've identified who we need it from. We then need to start identifying the frequency of that data, right? So do I need this data monthly, quarterly, yearly? Each data point will be different. And my advice would be get away with doing it as infrequently as possible, right? Because data reporting doesn't change the world, right? It's the outcomes and the actions that we take from it that change the world. So make sure this doesn't become the core focus, and you're not putting 80% of effort into the data reporting. So it comes back to my point, as infrequently as possible, right? As you can get away with, and particularly when you're asking your supply chain to do this, right? So now we're in a position where we know what the ask is from our suppliers. So we've got to find mechanisms to get them to actually buy into it and comply. I don't want to criticize anyone, but I work a lot in construction and infrastructure, and compliance in that space isn't the best in some areas, right? Thankfully, it is for health and safety, but in other areas a little bit less. So how would you get your supply chain to come on board and go to the effort of helping you collect this data? Now, of course, we talked, I briefly mentioned, prioritization of suppliers, who you prioritize in terms of asking their data. Think strategically, who are you a strategic client to, right? Obviously, with them, it's going to be an easier conversation as opposed to someone who doesn't do much work for you. So that comes into play. You can, there's a carrot and stick here. You can put it into contracts, make it a legal obligation. Think about what happens if they breach that, right? So the legal obligation would be, right, to do work with us, you must report your carbon emissions, and you must report the amount of waste that you generate and, the different streams of waste. Does the waste go to landfill? Does it get recycled? Does it go to recovery centers and so on and so forth? And how frequently, right? So you might document that in contracts so there's sort of no way around it. And if you breach that contract, what are the consequences? That's a good starting point. That's probably the preferable starting point because it set expectations. Your suppliers, ideally, you tell them at the tender stage, and with the clients that we see that do it best, they communicate that at the tender stage so everyone knows what they're getting into. They can factor the reporting and the complexities into their prices, right? Which is fair that you pay them for this, and then they sort of get into that relationship. However, I would say that sometimes, first of all, that's not possible, and sometimes there are other mechanisms that you can use. Why it might not be possible? Because sometimes you've already got contracts with your supply chain, and multi-year contracts, etc. So you're going to have to wait till the next renewal and so on. That might be difficult. Sometimes you might find it difficult to get it into the contract as well, that type of requirement, depending on your situation. So you can think of other ways. And other ways would be, actually, if you've got it into contracts as well, you can sort of give a carrot, right? Reward organizations for reporting. So I've got examples of organizations that, gave financial penalties to those who didn't report the data on time, off quality, or just didn't do it. Some who give a bonus to those who report the data. What works well is actually don't just give a bonus for reporting the data, give the bonus for reporting the data, but actually achieving a target within it, right? So we want 95% of your waste or 100% of your waste to not go to landfill, right? That is avoided going to landfill. You will get a financial bonus or some sort of bonus, right, as a supplier if you achieve that, but also you've reported the data and all the evidence that goes alongside it, right? So like that motivates reporting. If I know that I'm going to get extra money for doing this and the reward is higher than the cost of reporting, then I'm going to do it. So that's sort of thinking purely on a very rational commercial point of view. But then there's other ways that you can get organizations doing it. You can use competition, right? So leaderboards, I've got some clients that do leaderboards with their suppliers. Leaderboards on just who actually complies with the reporting, right? So it's just, we're making you aware that, all of these companies are always reporting, they're always on time, they're always providing the data, it's always of quality, and so on and so forth. Versus these organizations are always late and so on, right? We're not doing anything about it. We're just communicating it. And, if this goes into, maybe a strategy report, or at least it goes to the head of procurement, to our chief procurement officer, right? That is going to have an impact on you as a supplier long-term, retaining business with that client. But other ways are also about education. and really explaining and doing a lot of education around why this is important and bringing companies on board. And you would start off with that. And I think the most successful programs that we have is really starts off with that. It's before you expect reporting to be of good data quality and actually your supply chain to report, you handhold them through the process, through a journey of understanding why you're doing this. And you use that as an opportunity to explore with them what would be the benefits to their business to understand their data, and what if they were doing this just for their business overall, right? Not just for the work that they're doing for you, but what if they're measuring this overall? What if they end up measuring this in their supply chain? What can that mean for them? Could it mean more business elsewhere? Could it mean that they identify opportunities for efficiency? Could it mean that, all the sustainability drivers, right? That they have better, their stakeholders are happier, their local community is, and so on and so forth. So what I find is most successful is when there's that understanding, right? Coupled with the commercial aspects, the motivators that I talked about, and I found that's really successful. Final point on this is also give an opportunity for your supply chain to input into the data that you're collecting and you're asking for them. Give them an opportunity to, even though you've put it in the contract, or what you need to report at the end of the day. Give an opportunity for your supply chain to say, look, I can't report this data, but I could report that, make it a collaborative exercise and engage them. Too often I have supply chain organizations coming to me and say, I've been asked to report this. There's just no way, or it's not pragmatic, or it doesn't even make sense to my business. And that's because the client hasn't gone through the effort of actually engaging with the supply chain and asking them the question. They've just gone, here you go, here's the requirement, comply. And then what we find is that, a year down the line, no data's been reported, or it's all rubbish data and it's of value to no one. The client's there thinking, well, I've done my job, I've tipped my box, but actually the data's bad, so they're happy, but they're not happy. And the supplier's unhappy because, they've provided rubbish data, or in some instances they haven't, and we're nowhere. So engage with the supply chain right up front. I haven't finished on this, but broadly speaking, those are the sort of key pieces I think that typically are best practice to get you to a point where you've got your supply chain going, right, I'm going to report my data. So the process doesn't stop there. Now you go into a mechanism whereby you would hope that your supply chain is educated, you've agreed with them collaboratively what data points they should provide. These all make sense to you, to them. You've identified the stakeholders within their business who's meant to report this data. You've put the correct incentivization mechanisms in place. It's in the contracts. They've had the opportunity to factor this work in on their side as well. And it all helps you. You're 100% sure that it helps you to measure the key performance indicators that you need to measure, and ultimately maybe report on to someone else, or do take the actions that you need from that data. So I'll stress that point, you're always linking it back to a key driver. Otherwise, you're collecting data, there's no point in doing it, right? It's just going to sit there. I've seen that happen a lot of times as well. Clients going, I need 150 data points, and they just don't use it, Which actually, I should have talked about phasing as well. I would say sometimes you want to phase things in. You don't want to do 0 from 100 overnight. You want to phase things in. So we're at the point where our supply chain is ready to report. You need mechanisms in place during that process. And typically that's where sort of software comes in, right? To help streamline that process. So there's just really standard things that you want to think about. So first of all, you've been really clear on the requirements. You've been really clear on the definitions. You've been, everyone's got all the support that they need. They know who they can reach out to for additional information, or if they get stuck. They know they've got clear deadlines in terms of when they need to report. They know what the data should represent from a timeline perspective, is this data about my business, or is it about the work that I'm specifically doing for you? I'll come back to that point later on, if that's okay, about reporting for a business and reporting for, as a supplier, reporting for my whole business, or reporting for the work that I'm doing for a client. So in the mechanisms, you want reminders of reporting, deadlines. You want ideally sort of expected thresholds of data, and if you're using a software, often what you can do is put limits, warning signs, going, this looks really odd, or this is particularly low, or this is much lower than your previous 5 reports or something. You want chasing if they don't report. If you don't do the chasing, then people are going to know that they can get away with it, right? You ideally want a mechanism whereby the data is, depending on what data, the importance of, the quality of the data, what you can get away with. You might need it to be sense checked or verified or validated or audited, right? So you need to think about all of those things and when you do them. The best time that we find to give feedback to suppliers is immediately as they're reporting their data. So that's where those thresholds and sort of automated flags can come in handy in a software solution. There's other ways of doing that, right, outside of software. What we also find is what's really helpful is when clients go back to their suppliers really sort of periodically or even every time they report with some sort of dashboard or some sort of analysis or at least a thank you, right? So the supplier knows it's been acknowledged and they come back the next reporting period to provide their data. That's where we see the most success. We've got other clients that we work with that almost go, check all the information on a 6-monthly basis or a yearly basis, and then they go and do a cleanup process, which tends to be a little bit more cumbersome. You tend to have more cleanup to be done when you do it less frequently. It takes more effort to do it frequently at the beginning, but it pays off quite soon after. I would just say a little caveat as well is that when you're expecting your supply chain to report data to you, always expect the beginning to almost be useless data. Expect errors, etc. So if you need to start collecting data, I don't know, you might be under the EU CSRD regulations. Get started before those regulations kick in so you can get everyone used to the process. You can always omit that data. The benefit there is that you're going through the process, check the information, and then you're building people up to a certain quality level. So those are, just a few things to then get you, to a point where you're getting good quality data and you're actually getting people to comply. And feedback, as I mentioned before, feedback on the reporting performance. So how many people are actually reporting, or are you doing that on time, etc. I've mentioned that. But then also feedback on the actual performance itself, if you can. Well, it's really useful. We see clients who implement targets for their supply chain on the data, right? So they sort of filter down their own targets into the supply chain, and that tends to be really helpful because it gives the supplier some feedback. They know, all right, how am I doing against that target, and don't use that target to castigate. I'll go into the actions next, using the data, but use the targets to work with your suppliers if they're missing them, right? And understand how can we develop your capabilities so that you're able to achieve these targets, right? It's not about punishment. If you make it about punishment when suppliers don't, fail on the targets, you're discouraging them from reporting. And because suddenly they're giving you this data, they're being honest about it, and you're seeing that they're not achieving the targets, and you might say, I don't want to work with you, or I don't know, I'll give you a financial penalty. I would say it's probably okay to give a financial penalty if they haven't reported the data. That's like, you'd promise you go to the effort and you've not done it. But if they haven't hit it, give an opportunity to rectify, work with them, collaborate with them, develop their capability, because ultimately that's good procurement practice, right? You want to continue developing the capability of your supply chain, of potential suppliers, etc. If you start omitting the ones that fail, you're going to reduce over time your supplier pool, and that's Sean, as you know, that's not good practice, right? That the price goes up, right? Competition goes down and the price goes up. So you don't want to do that. So yes, don't discourage people from reporting. If they report, that's where you get the congratulations. Then we look together maturely at the actual sustainability performance, and then we work together on solving those problems together, and remember, a lot of the times what I find is some clients are asking their suppliers, sometimes I see this, clients asking suppliers to perform better than the client actually does. It's a really big organization, they set a strategy and they set targets and they push those targets down to the supply chain, and they're unhappy with suppliers who don't meet their target, but actually as a business they don't meet it themselves, so always just be a little bit humble and go, it's difficult. Even if you do achieve it, understand that it can be difficult, particularly for smaller organizations in your supply chain. It's about helping together and trying to upskill together. So that leads to actions, right? And it's just a reminder that there's a loop. You use all of this data for your actions. You go back to your drivers, you look at that, you work on it collaboratively, and you don't stop at, I've got the data now, let's just put it in a report. What is the use of that? Let's do some stuff against it. I'll take a breather there.
Yeah, it's all about the performance ultimately, and I think just I'm sure our audience would appreciate an awful lot of practical guidance coming out there, and a lot of people in my experience are talking about sustainability, data reporting, and all of that stuff, but you've actually been doing it with clients for a number of years, and I think that experience is really valuable. So, the key messages, which is kind of quite interesting from a guy that sells software solutions to clients, report as infrequently as possible, as little as possible, because and prioritize with your suppliers, because you're absolutely right. A lot of clients, when they get a hold of a piece of software like yours, other software solutions are available, of course, hundreds of them these days, they're like a kid in a sweet shop and they want to collect everything. Thanks very much, Charles, for sharing your insights and your view on the process that people might need to set up to start on sustainability, ESG reporting. This is part 1 of 2 of our podcast. We look forward to part 2, when Charles will share some practical advice on how to overcome some of the challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.